Hello everybody, and welcome to our first dedicated lecture in cultural connections to fashion. We're starting at the beginning, at the turn of the century. This time we're going to be looking at the 1900s and 1910s. Listen to that music. This music is very typical for this era, extremely popular. Do any of you know what it's called? It's called ragtime, and any of you who have visited Walt Disney World or Walt Disneyland in California will know this music, because as soon as you arrive, what's the first place you visit? Main Street, USA, which is the Disney reconstruction of an ideal small-town, turn-of-the-century American town. And ragtime is heard continuously. The most famous ragtime musician was this guy, Scott Joplin. Not only was he the first ever African-American superstar, he was one of the first recording stars too, using that wonderful new technology, records. So hold on to your hats and let's move into the turn of the century. This era is also known as the Edwardian era. I'm sure you've heard that term before, haven't you? Edwardian. And the reason it's called the Edwardian era was because of this guy, King Edward VII of England. Edwardian. When you see something like this, you know it is Edwardian. This is Edwardian fashion. You see, although Edward II died in 1910, the term Edwardian is actually often extended to include the years leading up to World War I, which began in 1914, and which of course we're going to look at much later in this lecture. Never confuse Edwardian with Victorian. Anything in the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, will not be Victorian, because Queen Victoria died in 1901 and King Edward VII became king. So, when talking about life internationally during this era, like in America here, look at this fabulous New York street scene at the turn of the century. Take a look. So bustling, so busy. When we talk about life internationally, we use the term turn of the century. However, when talking about fashion, we tend to say Edwardian, even though that term truly only belongs to England, right? Because Edward VII was the King of England and the king of the whole British Empire. India, Australia, Canada, it goes on and on. At this point in history, England was far more important than America. However, we see at the beginning of the 20th century, America suddenly becoming the most powerful nation in the world, which is why the 20th century is often called the American century. So, what was life like at the turn of the century? Well, it was an era of tremendous, life-changing technical advancement. You know how at the turn of our century, as we went from the 20th to the 21st, it was all about technology, right? Computers and iPads and tablets and mobile phones and internet. And it really changed our lives, right? Well, the same was true at the turn of the 20th century, because this was the era of electricity. Now, of course, electricity had always been around. Electricity exists in nature. But it was during this era that we learned to harness electricity and make it work for us. And boy, oh boy, did it change our world. Electricity changed our homes. It extended our day. Sure, you could read around a gas lamp, but really, once the sun set, life was very limited, and it always had been. Suddenly, electricity changed that. It lit up our homes and it extended our evenings. It lit up the workplace. This meant that people could work longer hours, make more money to buy things that would make their lives easier, run on electricity, like this vacuum cleaner here. And please note the way the woman is dressed. We'll look more at fashion in a second, obviously. Electricity lit up the night. Prior to electric streetlights that you see here, streets were lit by gas lamps, gaslight, which was quite dim. The gas would run out quite quickly, and the streets were kind of a dangerous place to be out after dark. They were also kind of a dirty place to be. Remember, this was still really the era of horse-drawn vehicles, although we're going to see that changing very quickly thanks to electricity. And so there was an awful lot of horse manure on the streets of cities like New York. Electric street lights changed everything. You could go out at night, you could see where you were going, you could avoid the poo on the streets. This led to nightlife. Now, of course, there had always been bars and a few restaurants, but the fact that electricity could light up the night and light up establishments saw a tremendous boom in bars. Electricity changed the way we got around. The turn of the century was the era of the electric street tram, or the street trolley. Like you see here, suddenly around the world, cities had rails built all along them and through them, everywhere. And these wires ran down streets that charged the trains with an electric current. So suddenly, you could actually get around. You could go and visit a friend on the other side of a city very easily, whereas before you would have to get a horse-drawn carriage. Boy, this was a modern era. What else? It was the era of the first subways. Take a look at this picture here. Please note their hats. Subways in New York and London and Paris. This subway car isn't really very different to our subway cars, is it? And I tell you what I noticed when I was just putting this PowerPoint together for you. If you look in the left, you see it says, "This car reserved exclusively for women." Okay, fair enough, you're thinking turn of the century. But isn't it strange that, more than 100 years later, right now, we're having discussions about gender and public bathrooms. Men, women, gender neutral. Does a transgendered boy in school get to use the girls' toilet? This is really a talking point at the moment, isn't it? So I thought it was kind of funny that here we see that this subway car is reserved exclusively for women. Because of electricity, architecture changed. Do you recognize this building under construction at the turn of the century? Of course, this is the Flatiron Building. Prior to this era, buildings were not very tall. Really, you're looking 10, 12 stories at the most. Suddenly, because of electricity, buildings shot up. Can you figure out why? Because of elevators. Suddenly, because of electricity, we could have elevators. Nobody wants to walk up, 45 flights, do they? But because of the elevator, it changed the landscape. Because suddenly we started getting very tall buildings, like the Flatiron Building, or the Woolworth Building. This is in downtown Manhattan. At the turn of the century, there were people who refused to get into an elevator and go up to the upper stories of buildings like the Woolworth Building. They felt it was unnatural. They were frightened. And because of electricity, we got the first World Wide Web, the telephone. The telephone. Prior to telephones, if you wanted to contact somebody, you would either have to go and visit them, or write them a letter, or send them a telegram, which was expensive, so that was only for important news. Suddenly, you could pick up the phone and call someone. So this meant that ideas could be communicated much faster. This meant that there was a social element at the turn of the century that people had never really been able to enjoy before, purely because of practical reasons. What else was happening? This was the era of the car. At the turn of the century, not many people owned cars. In fact, the same number of people owned a car at the turn of the century as people own private jets today in America. However, by the time we get into the 1910s, more and more people were buying cars and using cars, and by the time we hit the 20s and 30s, cars had replaced the horse. By the 20s, the car had replaced the horse. At the beginning of the age of the automobile, only very rich people had them, and they didn't really know what to do with them, so they would just go out for rides. Suddenly, people started to realize, hang on, this is more than a toy. This vehicle is actually kind of useful, and it's been useful ever since. What else? The aeroplane. This was the age of flight, something that people had been trying to figure out forever. Remember all of those Leonardo da Vinci flying machines that you've probably encountered at one point or another? Suddenly, the world took flight. So this was an age of tremendous change, tremendous excitement, tremendous modernity. We had electricity, we had tramcars, we had subways, we had motor vehicles, we had aeroplanes. So why the hell did we still dress like this? Haha. That's the question we're going to attempt to answer. You see, the world was moving too quickly, technologically, so aesthetics suddenly embraced the concept of nostalgia for the very first time. The chief design movements of this era, from which fashion would take its lead, deliberately embracing the natural, organic world, as well as a romanticized Middle Ages. The world was simply moving too quickly. Don't worry, by the time we get into the 1910s, the world would catch up. Fashion would catch up, culture would catch up, art would catch up. But at the turn of the century, at the beginning, everything was moving too quickly, so people clung to the past to such an extent that they embraced the past, right? Suddenly, these huge buildings were flying into the sky, like the Woolworth building, for example. Nobody had ever seen buildings like that. The streets were full of trams and cars. Electricity was buzzing everywhere. And so suddenly, the natural world, the organic world, became very appealing. I suppose we're sort of doing the same thing today, aren't we? I think the world has moved too quickly in the past 20 years for fashion to keep up with it. That's certainly true, which is why, we're looking at the 20s, we're looking at the 70s, we're looking at the 60s, the 80s are back, the 30s are back. Honestly, we have not changed the way that we dress since the 1990s. You'll see that we haven't. And we will. Fashion will change. It will, catch up eventually. But when the world changes too quickly, sometimes fashion is a little bit confused and clings to past ideas until it gets its strong direction from the world that creates it. But all of this will make much more sense as we go through the course. So, this chief aesthetic that people were in love with at the turn of the century going into the 1910s is called Art Nouveau. Those of you who have taken fashion history and global attire encountered it very briefly. Those of you who have taken art history certainly know about Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau was an embrace of nature. It was organic. Think about the world, how it was looking. a lot of reinforced steel, a lot of reinforced concrete, electricity, industry, technology, urbanization. Art Nouveau was a reaction to this. It was a backlash. It was about flowers and plants, everything swirling. You're not going to find any straight edges or geometric shapes in Art Nouveau. All of these beautiful swirling curvilinear shapes. It informed architecture. Look at this. This is by the Spanish architect Gaudi. Art Nouveau was an international movement in the West. Take a look at that building. It looks like it's growing. It's almost like troglodyte dwellings, isn't it? Built into cliffs. No straight edges. Look at this Art Nouveau chair. All of those curvilinear organic lines. This, I love. This is a subway station in Paris. And look how organic it is. This is such a perfect example of Art Nouveau. As is this lamp, an electric lamp, of course, a Tiffany lamp. Tiffany we associate with this era, with the Art Nouveau era, and all of their beautiful glass lamps. An electric lamp, to be sure. Check out the palette. The Art Nouveau palette, we're talking russets and sage green, things like that. Very organic colors. Look at this interior. From the door frame to the tiling, all of those swirls. And look at this Art Nouveau staircase here with the swirls. And if you look at the banister, it's all of these curvilinear shapes. Do you know where this staircase is, or where it was? Well, now it's many, many leagues under the sea, because this is the grand staircase of the Titanic. Of course, this is the era of the Titanic. And you know what? Fashion and homeware are still in love with Art Nouveau. Take a look at this mirror. This isn't from the turn of the century. This is from the internet. I think it's $49.99. This is a modern mirror, but obviously completely inspired by Art Nouveau. As is this. It's a coffee pot. It is not from the turn of the century. No, I think it's from Target. And look at that bathroom. Look at the tiling. Look at the mirror. Isn't it fabulous? Completely inspired by Art Nouveau, but given a very contemporary twist. And fashion goes back to Art Nouveau time and time again. Take a look at this. Look at the swirling design. Also gold. Touches of gold often featured in Art Nouveau, so this dress really has it down. As does this. Art Nouveau design, you often get sort of a mirrored effect, kind of like a butterfly's wings, and you can really see that played out to effect on this dress here. And look at those Art Nouveau Prada shoes. Wouldn't you love a pair of those? I sure would. And here is a fashion editorial that completely draws on Art Nouveau, especially in palette. There are a few artists and designers associated with the Art Nouveau movement that I want you to be aware of, just for your general education, because they're really, really famous, but also because of their ongoing influence upon fashion. And the first person I want to talk to you about is somebody called William Morris. And there he is. Now, William Morris actually began his career in the previous century, in the 19th century, and was associated with something called the arts and crafts movement, which was, again, a return to an earlier pre-industrial age. But his work continued through the turn of the century, and just looking at this backdrop here, it's probably quite familiar to you, because William Morris and his designs, which were very influenced by medieval tapestries, by the natural world, by this very muted organic palette, His designs have never really fallen out of popularity. They come and go. In the 1970s, William Morris had a huge revival, and then he sort of fell out of favor, but he's certainly coming back. This is another example of an iconic William Morris print. He designed wallpaper, he designed textiles. This is what William Morris did. And you can see everything is very curvilinear, it's very organic, a lot of trees, a lot of leaves, a lot of flowers, a lot of fruit. And again, a William Morris print. It's really kind of lovely, isn't it? And here again, it is rather medieval, is it not? Sort of reminds me of the Lady and the Unicorn tapestry, La Dame et les Licornes, that beautiful famous tapestry from the Middle Ages. And voila, there is Marc Jacobs. Well, not him, I hope. A model wearing a Marc dress from his recent William Morris collection. So you see, this is kind of why you need to know this stuff, right? And that is a William Morris print on a pillow. For those of you interested in homeware, this is new. This is from, I don't know, JCPenney's, I suppose. I have no idea. I got it off Google Shopping. But you can see the everlasting appeal of William Morris. And there's a William Morris iPhone cover. And again, William Morris. The relationship between fashion in the 21st century and everything that happened in the 20th century is so enormous, which is what Cultural Connections is all about. Now, what I'm showing you now, the contemporary takes on something we've studied in the course, this is what I call a cultural connection. And you're going to be making 30 of them. Your own cultural connections in your big final project, your BFP, as I call it. And there's William Morris again on a sweatshirt. See? And there on a man's button-down. A fine artist from this era that I want you to be aware of is Gustav Klimt. And there he is, looking rather artsy in his artist smock with his cat. Klimt, we associate him with the Art Nouveau era, a lot of swirls, but he actually went back to the Byzantine era with a lot of gold, a lot of mosaic effects. I'm sure you've seen this very famous piece of art by Klimt. It's called The Kiss, and you can see it has all of this gold, kind of like a very enamely mosaic kind of look, very Byzantine. Those of you who have studied fashion history and global attire, you remember when we did the Byzantine Empire, right? And voila, this is a beautiful Oscar de la Renta gown, completely influenced and inspired by Klimt. As is this beautiful fashion editorial here. This is Klimt, and this is Prada. You can see why you need to know this stuff, right? Another figure from this era that I want you to be aware of is Aubrey Beardsley. And there he is with quite a spectacular profile. Aubrey Beardsley was more of an illustrator, a graphic designer. And here is an example of his work. Always in black and white, well, 95% of the time in black and white, and you can really see that it marries itself to the Art Nouveau aesthetic with all of these curvilinear shapes. Aubrey Beardsley is extremely important. He was also a fashion illustrator, so again, a reason you should know him. And here are some runway looks that are obviously inspired by the work of Aubrey Beardsley, right? But I guess the person we associate the strongest with the Art Nouveau movement is Alphonse Mucha. Just call him Mucha. And there he is. I am 99.99999.99999% sure that you are very familiar with his work already. completely in the Art Nouveau style with the Art Nouveau palette. He was famed for painting these beautiful women, sort of wearing pseudo-medieval or pseudo-classical attire, with flowing hair, everything flowing into each other. Hair flowing into flowers, flowing into trees. Here he is personifying gemstones, topaz, rubies, amethysts, and emeralds. And famously, this is his 4 seasons. If you go across, you can see all of the seasons with these beautiful Mucha girls. On the left, that's spring, and then summer, and then fall, and then if you look on the right, I love winter. Look at these long flowing gowns and the auburn hair, just so organic. But he was a commercial artist. You know what I mean by that, right? We regard him as a fine artist now, his work hanging in museums, but in his time, he did calendars and champagne labels here for Moet et Chandon. And by the way, it's actually pronounced Moet et Chandon, not Moet et Chandon. Little known secret. Moet is the way the family pronounce their names, but I'm very uncomfortable saying Moet et Chandon because people might think I don't know that you don't pronounce the last T in French normally. But look at this beautiful label for a champagne bottle. Completely in the Art Nouveau aesthetic, but come on, you know instantly that this is Mucha, right? Another piece of commercial art. This is an ad for beer. Bière de la Muse. Take a look at that Mucha lady there. He often incorporated flowers and natural elements in hair. And I love these 2 or 3, 4, how many, I don't know, enormous poppy flowers on the side of her head. So take a look at that poster for beer by Mucha. And then take a look at this runway shot from Anna Sui, and you can see that she is completely drawing on Mucha here, right? From the poppies on the side of the head to the palette to that swirling curvilinear design of the dress. Here is a fashion editorial completely inspired by Mucha. The flowing auburn hair and that endless gown. Here is a watch ad inspired by Mucha. Here is a fashion editorial that's obviously inspired by Mucha. And this one really is. So this is why you need to know this stuff, right? No matter what you decide to do with your careers. More Mucha. Alright, we're going to turn to fashion now. Those of you who have taken fashion history and global attire with me or caught any of my videos on the other Vimeo channel devoted to fashion history and global attire know already that the body ideal changes decade by decade. And so a lot of this will be familiar to you if you have taken fashion history. But I want to introduce you to this woman because you're going to be meeting her a lot. She is what we call the Grecian ideal. All right, remember ancient Greece? The Grecian ideal is what artists have declared to be the most perfect female body, based on statues, on Greek statuary, particularly of Aphrodite. So this is the Grecian ideal, and in fact, today's runway models, they're a little bit thinner, but they are very much based on the same proportions as this Grecian ideal. 7.5 heads tall, that makes her 5'9". Small high breasts, a natural waist, full hips, and curvaceous legs. This is the ideal woman. In fact, when artists buy those little models to practice their sketching, it is the Grecian ideal, these proportions. So although this might be the overarching ideal for a woman in terms of art, in terms of fashion and popular culture, you are going to be amazed at how much the ideal body would change decade by decade. Sometimes she was tall, sometimes she had large breasts, sometimes she had small breasts, sometimes she had big shoulders, sometimes she had tiny shoulders, sometimes she was short, sometimes she was Amazonian. But take a look at these sketches here that my dad, David Wolf, kindly did for me, that have come in so useful in so many of my courses. And you can trace the change in the ideal body throughout the 20th century. It's quite extraordinary. Now, obviously, not every woman in the 1930s, for example, had the ideal body of the 1930s, but they would use clothing and undergarments to try to achieve the look of the ideal body, and we still do this today, don't we? So all that understood, let's take a look at the ideal body of the turn of the century. Here is our Grecian ideal, so we can compare. And this is the ideal body of the turn of the century. And you can see she is almost as tall, but her proportions are very different. Elegant, tall, with a very long neck, a very full bosom, a tiny, tiny waist, and very full, round hips. Did anyone actually have this body? Well, she did. Miss Camille Clifford. She was an actress and a socialite. And why do you think she became famous? She became famous because of her body, because she had the ideal body. Just in the same way Kim Kardashian became famous, because she had the body ideal. This is something that you will see time and time again throughout the 20th century. Why did Marilyn Monroe become so famous during the 1950s? Because she had the ideal body. This type of figure, as you know, is called an hourglass because it's shaped like an hourglass. It's also known as wasp-waisted. Wasp-waisted, that is a wasp. And you'll see that wasps are kind of constructed of two round bulbous sections that meet in the middle with a tiny little waist. So this kind of body, we call it an hourglass figure, but we can also call it wasp-waisted. And you can see that fashion responded to the body ideal. It always does. The body comes first and fashion follows. So what did women do to achieve this incredible shape? Well, this was the age of extreme corsetry. Take a look at this. This is an ad for all the different kinds of corsets that a particular company is selling. And yes, there's slight variations in how they're constructed, but the shape remains the same, pulling you in so tightly at the waist that any excess flesh is either pushed up to the bosom or pushed out to the hips. This is interesting. You can see these corsets really worked. Take a look at the image of this lady without her corset, and then look at the way her body changes when she puts her corset on. I'll do it again, see? Suddenly she has a tiny hourglass waist. So uncomfortable, horrendously uncomfortable though these corsets were, they did achieve the look. See? Now this is an image that I find very interesting. Take a look at her waist. It is minute, it is tiny, but aha! I am a very good detective. And when you really examine this image in print with a magnifying glass, you can see that her waist has actually been touched up. to look even smaller. Of course, this is the era before Photoshop by many, many decades, but yet you could still contort an image. And this certainly has been. You can see, if you look closely enough, and maybe you can see it too, the brush strokes where the dark background of the chair has been duplicated and painted to paint over her waist to make it even smaller. And I find this very interesting because we have so much discussion today, don't we, about photographs being enhanced via Photoshop and giving unrealistic expectations of beauty to women via Photoshop and touching up and all of this kind of thing. But this is nothing new. Look, they were actually doing it at the turn of the century. And again, you can see here, her picture has really been touched up. Nobody in the world could possibly have a waist this small. It would be ridiculous. And whoever was touching this picture up didn't do such a good job, because you can really see the brushwork there, can't you? But still, it's interesting because it shows what the ideal was. Totally unachievable in this instance. Other ways that women try to get this tiny waist, this will horrify you, and I know that those of you who took fashion history will certainly remember this. Women would ingest tapeworm eggs. Look, fat, 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 and always stay thin. Tapeworm eggs. The tapeworm egg would then hatch in your intestine, and the tapeworm would grow and would eat sort of 3/4 of anything that you ate. This is what a tapeworm looks like. So you would be having one of these guys in your stomach, in your intestine, for several months, and it would be eating away at all of your food, and you would get thinner and thinner. However, there were nasty side effects: constant diarrhea, horrible smelling breath. And then if you look at that tapeworm, you can see that there's a 12-inch ruler there. So you can see how long tapeworms grow. They grow many, many feet, 20 feet or so. And you'll notice that its body is sort of constructed out of segments. Well, when you finally wanted to get rid of your little friend, there were 2 ways to get rid of it. One, you could take a medicine, just bought in a drugstore, that would poison it and kill it. But you had to be sure that the head was free, because how a tapeworm latched onto you were with these little spikes on its mouth here. Yeah, I don't think you expected to see this, did you? Really not very nice, a picture of a tapeworm. So you had to be sure that the head was gone. And so what you had to do, because a tapeworm dies in segments, you would take the medicine, and then every time you went to the toilet to do a number 2, to put it as in a ladylike way, you would then have to put on gloves and go through your own feces to make sure you got the head. So each time you went through it, there would be a little bit more tapeworm, and you go through it, and then, after a week, voila, you found the head, and you knew that you were free. The other way, which is just as horrifying, you would take the day off, whatever you were doing, take your corset off, relax on a couch, reading Vogue, and you would hold a piece of raw meat near your mouth. The tapeworm would smell the meat and become so excited it would let go of your intestine, wiggle up through your throat, and come out to try to eat the meat, and then you would grab it and would have to haul it out hand over hand, all 20 feet of it. Both ways are horrible. Tapeworms are horrible. A student told me a couple of semesters ago that you can actually buy tapeworm eggs over the internet. Please don't do this. It's really very nasty. I know it seems extreme, but look at the extreme lengths we go to today to change the way we look. Sure, tapeworms are repulsive to us and extraordinary and horrible, and oh my God, what was wrong with these women? However, if we went back to 1905 and said, oh, guess what? 100 years in the future, women are going to cut into their own faces, or pay a doctor to cut into them, and pull all the skin back, and then sew it behind their ears. in the hopes that they'll look younger, these women would have fainted. And speaking of fainting, women fainted a lot during this era because of their tight corsets, which is why they often carried smelling salts with them, so they could revive themselves if they felt faint or in fact fainted. I have no idea if these women ingested tapeworm eggs or not. I like to think they didn't, but take a look at their bodies. And you can see this was a universal, in the Western world, ideal. Look at their tiny waists. Look at how hourglass and curvilinear these bodies are. But even then, people would joke about it. Look at this postcard, a humorous postcard from the era. Look at that flat-chested, kind of skinny spinster. I could throw a swell front if I padded. And the curvy lady is saying, that's what they all say. Because, of course, women would pad their breasts. They would pad their hips, again, to make their waist look smaller. But it wasn't about being thin. No, it was about having the hourglass shape. So it didn't matter if your waist was 35 inches around, as long as it was considerably smaller than your top half and your bottom half, to get that wasp waist look. Like that. And you can see this is not a particularly skinny woman at all. She has a beautiful turn-of-the-century hourglass figure, but why? Well, 2 reasons. 1, why did people love this body? Well, the first is that the world was becoming increasingly industrial. More and more women had to work. And so there was a natural return to the idea of femininity and motherhood and womanliness. But more than that, fashion is not an island. What is it? You know the answer. It's a response. And this body, this hourglass figure with all of its curves, really echoed, did it not, Art Nouveau. It was a response to the dominant aesthetic of the era. See? And again, that is Miss Camille Clifford. And look at that body. It's so completely Art Nouveau. The sands of the hourglass began to change as we get into the later years of the first decade of the 20th century, with something called the pigeon breast. The idea being that you contorted your body via corsetry into this S shape. The idea was to make it look like you had one enormous breast, like a pigeon, right? That stuck out at the front with your butt sticking out at the back. Again, achieved through corsetry. It was called the safety corset because people did start to realize that maybe cinching in your waist so ridiculously tightly might in fact damage your internal organs, which it most definitely did. So the safety corset, which gave this pigeon-breasted look, and we call it the pigeon breast today, was seen as being healthier, but also it was just a new twist on an old idea, because of course this curvy S shape again just speaks to the Art Nouveau aesthetic, doesn't it? Here is a contemporaneous diagram. You all know what contemporaneous means. It's different to contemporary. Contemporaneous means something of the era you are under discussion, that you are discussing. So a contemporaneous diagram here, effect of an old style corset, the effect of the new style corset. You can really see this S shape, can't you? And everybody did it. See? This idea of one enormous breast kind of lurching forward, small waist with your derriere sticking out in a curve at the back. So, Art Nouveau. Okay, we looked at the body ideal. Let's look at the beauty ideal of the turn of the century, and guess what? It was based on a total myth. In fact, it was based on an illustration. This illustration. She was known as the Gibson Girl because she was the invention, the creation of this man, a commercial artist called Charles Dana Gibson. He was a fashion illustrator, he was a commercial artist, and he designed, if you will, the beauty ideal, who's known as the Gibson Girl. Now, he was American, and this is important because in the first decade of the 20th century, it was the first time ever that an American beauty ideal would be the dominant beauty ideal in the Western world. This was a first. Before, it had either been English style or French style or back in the Renaissance Italian style. This is the first time we're seeing American style as the beauty ideal. There is another Charles Dana Gibson illustration of the Gibson Girl, and you can see she had a very long neck, these sort of heavy-lidded eyes, sort of like she was looking down her nose at you, and this incredible hair piled up into what is known as a cottage loaf hairdo. Cottage loaf was a type of bread. That was a big mound of bread with a smaller mound of bread on top, sort of like a roll. And this was the hairdo, very large. And again, you can see that this completely, oh, there is a cottage loaf, so you know what it's what it looks like. You can see that it completely spoke to the era, this idea of Art Nouveau. Here are two ladies, one of them's probably Camille Clifford, she seems to get everywhere, having tea. Gibson girls come to life with these very long necks and this sort of snooty demeanor. But this was the overarching ideal. This is how every woman did their hair. It's how every single woman, no matter where she came from in the Western world, if she came from Australia, if she came from California, if she came from England, if she came from France, she wanted this look. We see it time and time again. And it really reminds us that there was an era when people followed fashion's rules very strictly. And there's a beautiful, beautiful photograph there, the very pretty girl with the cottage loaf hairdo. And look, again, based on these swirling, curvilinear aesthetics of Art Nouveau, the dominant design aesthetic, right? Fashion followed, it didn't lead. Fashion never leads, it always follows. Why? Because fashion is not an island. What is it? Oh, you know the answer. A response. So, some of you may remember my favorite teaching tool from Fashion History and Global Attire, which I have recycled for this course. How the beauty ideal of any given era was achieved. My favorite teaching tool starts with this girl. Who is she? No idea. I got her off Google, but we decided to call her Sarah. So, very little makeup was worn at the turn of the century. Really only prostitutes and actresses wore makeup, but women would wear powder and a little rouge, a little blush to give them a healthy look. And then, of course, the cottage loaf hairdo that would often be adorned with feathers and flowers and tortoiseshell combs. And you can see it was very easy to achieve the beauty look. All you needed was hair you could sit on, basically. The longer your hair, the more beautiful you were considered. Now, some women did wear a little lipstick during this era, but it was very, very natural. And most women actually didn't wear lipstick because that was a little bit risque. And here we have it again, the beauty ideal. And here it is today, the Gibson Girl reborn for the 21st century. And again here. And again here. The palette, the fashionable palette of the Edwardian era was this. It was soft, pastels, mauve. Mauve was a very popular color. Ivory, cream. Women did not wear bright colors. Absolutely not. This palette was dusty. It was feminine. It was light. To be fashionable at the turn of the century, you had to be exceedingly feminine and ridiculously adorned. You could not have too many artificial silk flowers. You could not have too much lace. You could not have too much trim. Fashionable meant adorned. See what I mean? Take a look at that. Do you like it? I think it's rather beautiful and elegant, but please note the size of her hat. Feathered hats were the thing. The more feathers you could have on your hat, the more fashionable you were. Believe it or not, there were entire species of birds that became extinct forever and ever at the turn of the century because of the passion for their feathers. Some of these hats would weigh up to 60 pounds. Imagine walking around with that on your head. If you pick up a feather, it's very light. You pick up a sack of feathers, it's suddenly very heavy. The accessory of choice for the fashionable lady of this era was a parasol. And you can see in this image here, the lady is carrying a parasol. What did she use it for? Please do not say to keep the sun off her face, because I think that hat is going to keep the sun off her face. No, women carried parasols to help them balance. Imagine you have a 60-pound hat on your head and you are squeezed in with one of these awful corsets. You actually used your parasol to help you balance, sort of like a tightrope walker uses a pole. Hats got enormous. The bigger the hat, the more fashionable you were. They were called cartwheel hats because they were as big and as round as a cartwheel. Take a look at that cartwheel hat. Look at the amount of feathers that are on top of it. It must have weighed a ton. Look at that hat. It's extraordinary. This woman would have been considered extremely fashionable by virtue of the size of her hat and all of the stuff that's on it. Want to see a really big hat? Check out that really big hat. I always think that the woman in this picture looks an awful lot like Helena Bonham Carter, don't you? But look at that hat. It's sort of exquisite, but sort of ridiculous too. With urbanization came the need for more and more women to work for their living, you see, and so wealthy women made it very clear through their attire that they didn't have to work. Look at that hat. You cannot go and work in a factory or be a secretary wearing a hat like that, right? So we're seeing clothing used as status, as it always is. And here are some more recent runway images that obviously draw from the elegant opulence of the Edwardian era. But as I just mentioned, a great many women did have to work. They worked in factories. Take a look at this image. Please note their cottage loaf hairdos. There was a time when fashion followed rules. Everybody had a cottage loaf hairdo. Look at these telephone operators. The new technology allowed for new careers, just as the technology that we've recently seen, internet, computers, that kind of thing, has created a whole bunch of new careers. So did the technology at the turn of the century. So these are telephone operators putting calls through. Women worked as secretaries, they worked as accountants. Again, please note the cottage loaf hairdo. And I love this picture. Sure, she's got her cottage loaf hairdo, but she's also got a bit of an attitude. There she is with her stockinged feet on her desk. There was one item of clothing at the turn of the century that every woman, regardless of whether she worked or not, regardless of her social class, regardless of her income, regardless of where in the country she lived, she would own. And this was the shirtwaist. Basically, a shirtwaist was a blouse. Always in light colors, cream, ivory, white, and it would be worn with a heavy, dark-coloured skirt, either made of wool or made of tweed, something sensible. The idea behind the shirtwaist was this. It was a big deal to launder a dress, but with a blouse, hey, you can wear it once or twice. People tended to wear their clothes far longer than we do today because it was much more of a drama to get things cleaned. You would wear your shirtwaist, this blouse, and when it became a little bit soiled, you could change it for another one, and you wouldn't have to launder your skirt, which is why the skirt part of the shirtwaist ensemble was usually in a dark colour. This is what working women wore, women who went to work, but this is what rich and fashionable ladies would wear when they were at home, going about their business, doing the household accounts, etc. Look at this picture. It just speaks volumes. Every single one of these women are wearing the outfit I just described, the light-colored shirtwaist with the dark, heavy skirt. And sometimes they would have a little decorative detail hanging from the belt. The belt was nearly always a dark-colored, usually black cummerbund, and then they would have a little watch hanging or a little sort of a trinket hanging. A yard of Priscilla shirtwaist designs. This was a craze. Women were nuts for shirtwaists, and you can tell, you can kind of date this ad because look, it's all pigeon-breasted women, isn't it? Everybody wore them. Sometimes they were very simple, sometimes they had lace and frills, but they really were an absolute craze. They were practical, and at this point, the world was moving so quickly, fashion was just kind of catching up, right, with clothing. You could get on the subway wearing this, right? Everybody had a shirtwaist. Often the skirt came with a matching jacket, so you can see the total ensemble here, and again note she has a little charm hanging from her waistband. There was a massive demand for shirtwaists, which were made by young women, usually young immigrant women, in factories throughout the industrial north. And I think that those of you who know your fashion history will know what I'm going to talk about. The Triangle Factory Shirtwaist Fire. This is in Manhattan. There was a factory that made shirtwaists and employed young immigrant girls, and it occupied 2 floors. I can't remember exactly which floors, but like the 12th and 13th floor of a building. There was an elevator in this building, and there was a fire escape. Sadly, the fire escape only went down sort of 3 flights. It was about 5 flights up from the ground, if not more. What happened one day, somebody threw the match to a cigarette. They lit their cigarette and threw a match into a garbage can full of scraps of fabric. The factory caught on fire. It was just 2 floors of a building. It caught on fire. The first couple of elevators did manage to go down, packed with girls, but so tragically, 150 or so girls died, many just hurling themselves, sort of like what happened in 9/11, hurling themselves out of the windows rather than be engulfed by flames. Look at this front page of the New York Herald here, and you can see so tragically the bodies of these young women. Of course, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was owned by men and run by men, but those young women did not die in vain, because after this awful tragedy, rules were put into place in the workplace. Codes. There had to be so many fire escapes. The fire escapes had to reach the floor. There had to be so many fire hoses and extinguishers, buckets of sand, etc., etc. So you know, whenever you're in a building like school and there is the fire drill and you're thinking, oh God, we've got to do the fire drill. Remember those girls who lost their lives in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. It's because of them that we do have fire drills and that we do keep our workplaces safe. So next time there's a drill, give them a little thought and a little prayer, and maybe then it all makes a bit more sense, doesn't it? It's a great thing that we have fire drills. Anyway, let's look at Edwardian gentlemen. There we go. I'll show you some images here. Really, Edwardian male attire wasn't that much different to what we saw in the late Victorian era, those of you who know that era. It was the ditto suit. A ditto suit is where the jacket matches the pants. In the Edwardian era, there was a bit of a craze for double-breasted. Of course, for evening, it was white tie, black tie, and tails. But for just hanging out, this was kind of the look. You see the ditto suit, ditto, meaning, like I just explained, the pants match the jacket. And please note their collars, Edwardian collars, were quite high, and they were removable, right? You'd have your shirt, but then you would attach your collar separately, because collars get very dirty. And so you would put on your fresh collar every day, which you would fasten with a stud, and then you would put your tie on. And take a look at that. They're wearing vests and waistcoats and bowler hats as well. Do you see the picture I just showed you? All of those three men are wearing what we call bowler hats, B-O-W-L-E-R, and the man on the right, you can really get a good read on what a bowler hat is. Well, as we've discussed, the turn of the century was a time of tremendous technological change. It really was the first steps into modernity as we know it. But it was also a time of terrible hardship for a great many people because of urbanization, because of modernity. Take a look at this picture. This little boy is fallen asleep on the job delivering papers. And this photograph was taken by somebody I want you to meet because he's a terribly important person in terms of the history of photography and the social history of the turn of the century. Meet Louis Hine. Louis Hine photographed the other side of the 20th century, this new exciting century full of tramcars and skyscrapers and telephones and ladies in huge cartwheel hats. He photographed the underbelly, those who had slipped through the cracks like this little boy here. Or these little boys here, children out to work. During this era, children worked. You became an adult very quickly. As soon as you were old enough to work, if you were a working class child, you did. You worked in the factories like this girl here. This is a very famous photograph called Mill Girl, and by Louis Hine. Excuse me. And you can see that although he's photographing something so unbelievably tragic, a child having to work 12, 14-hour days in a factory, the photograph itself is very beautiful. Look at all of those looms receding into the background. Now, Louis Hine would say, oh no, I'm photographing just what I see because I want people to become aware of these terrible conditions. However, he had such an artistic eye that it was sort of impossible for him not to create a beautiful photograph as he told this terrible story. This is a very famous photograph by Louis Hine. It's called Breaker Boys. And what did Breaker Boys do? Well, they worked in the coal mines of Pennsylvania, for example, of West Virginia. And these were very little boys, between the ages of about 4 and 5, and 14, 15, then they got too big if they lived. And they worked down the mines, and they would be pushed through sort of areas underground that were too big for an adult worker, and then they would break the coal so that they would create an opening wide enough for a grown-up to go through. I really want you to look at their faces. These are children. Look how old they look. The average life expectancy for a breaker boy was about 16, breathing in all of that coal dust all the time. It's so tragic. Look at these little boys selling newspapers on the streets of New York, I believe. And take a look at the boy on the left. He doesn't even have shoes. How old do you think these boys are? I think they must only be about 4 or 5 years old. Lewis Hines also photographed how people lived, especially the immigrant population, arriving in the United States, arriving at New York, getting processed through Ellis Island with such enormous hopes for the future, and they end up living many families to a room in these tenement buildings in these conditions. Yet this photograph is the most famous photograph by Lewis Hine. It just shows a worker, and it's called Powerhouse Mechanic. And look at how the mechanic's body is sort of making a circle, and then he's, you know, operating this sort of big circular sort of piece of industrial machinery, and everything circles around and around. It is an extremely famous photograph, and so I want you to become aware of it. This is not a photograph of hardship. This is a photograph of somebody just working. But any sort of notion that Lewis Hine just photographed what he saw, well, he did photograph what he saw, but he had such a tremendous eye. And to capture this picture at just this moment, you can see the composition is so perfect and so beautiful, and why this is. So, although the turn of the century was an age of dichotomies, really the best of times for some and the very worst of times for others, the good news is that we had the confidence to criticize. For example, the progressive movement. This was a social and political movement that set out to do away with the monopoly of industry, to address child labor, to criticize conditions in the workplace, to really be more progressive, to move life and work into the 20th century for everybody. What else? Not so much fun, in my opinion, the temperance movement. Remember, street light lit up the night, and suddenly people could go to bars. And there was an awful lot of drinking, too much drinking, according to some people who wanted to vote America dry, to ban the sale, manufacture, and distribution of alcohol. Preposterous, right? Aha! Just wait until we get into the 1920s, and you'll see that the temperance movement people got their way. You know they did, with prohibition. But really, the most significant, in my opinion, as a woman, movement of the turn of the century was this, the suffrage movement. Of course, women wanting the right to vote. Now, I don't know about you, but I always think that suffragettes have been sort of condemned to a memory of cuteness. Oh, these lovely ladies protesting with their little banners and sashes, and I think that's thanks to Mary Poppins. Remember in Mary Poppins, the mum was a suffragette, and she sings this cute little song about being a suffragette. And so I think that because of Mary Poppins, which came out in 1965, I believe, many years after the suffrage movement, suffragettes have always had this kind of image of cuteness. These women were not cute. These women were brave, incredibly brave. Bizarre and ridiculous though it is to us at the moment to think about this, people thought that if a woman wanted the right to vote, she must be mad. She must be morally corrupt. Women voting? But these women were brave. I love this picture here, and please note the cottage loaf hairstyle. They took to the streets to protest and were horribly abused for doing so. People would pick up handfuls of the horse dung, the horse manure, and chuck it at them. A protesting suffragette, it was not uncommon for someone just to come out of the crowd and punch them in the face. They were considered disgusting by a great many of the population. Police brutality is nothing new. We hear about it a lot today, don't we, in terms of America's African American community and police brutality. Take a look at the turn of the century, with suffragettes being victims of police brutality. And yet, they wouldn't stop. Suffragettes who were arrested for disturbing the peace and moral corruption were either put into jail or put into mental institutions, because obviously they have to be mad to want the vote, right? To want equal rights with men. But they didn't stop there. Suffragettes went on hunger strikes where they refused to eat. And here is an image which I find very disturbing of a suffragette being held down. And you see there's that rubber tube there that's going to be forced down her throat, and food will be pumped into her. Women would choke, obviously. This is horrible, unpleasant, just a nightmare. And yet they wouldn't stop protesting. And it's thanks to these women, these incredibly brave women at the turn of the century, that women today, like Hillary, can even exist politically. We've come a long way, haven't we? But it started with these suffragettes who were so brave. And what is the best way that we, women, can say thank you to them? Well, there is a way we can thank them. Vote. Always vote. They fought and they suffered, and some even died for your right to vote. So use it. And there's the man in the moon. What am I going to talk to you about now? Another fabulous new technology of the turn of the century. The moving picture. Another new technology that would change the world. Early moving pictures were very, very simple. Tiny little movies that showed something happening, like a train coming into a station. When this, it's very famous, little clip here, when this was first shown, people went screaming, evidently, from the theatre because they thought the train was going to crash through the screen. It didn't matter what was happening. There was no narrative. It was enough just to see an image moving. It was a miracle. It was miraculous. The Lumiere brothers, who are French, they really were the fathers of the moving image. And Train Entering Station is one of the Lumiere brothers' movies. But this man in the moon here, we have Georges Méliès to thank for that, another Frenchman. So you see, France really is the birthplace of the moving image. Georges Méliès produced the first feature-length movie with a story, with a narrative, and it was called Le Voyage dans la Lune, Trip to the Moon. And it was the first science fiction movie as well. So this was pretty ambitious, right? Not only the first full-length feature film, but it's also science fiction with special effects. And it told the story of a group of people who go to the moon. Look here. Now, this image that I'm showing you here, this moving image, is beautiful, but it's been colorized. Color film wouldn't be developed for another 20 years or so, but people would take the roll of film and they would, by hand, mind you, colorize it, paint it so that it would be color. It's beautiful. So they get into the rocket ship, and the rocket ship lands right in Mr. Moon's eye, and there he is. He doesn't look very happy about it, does he? Voyage to the moon, Le Voyage dans la Lune, Trip to the Moon, is beautiful, imaginative, and it really made people realize the potential of film. Take a look at this clip here, the astronauts, if you will. They've arrived on the moon, and they're seeing these incredible mushrooms, these massive mushrooms growing. This really was science fiction and so much fun. Well, before we go into the second part of the lecture, I thought we could take a look at some moving images of New York City at the turn of the century. Look at the clothing. Look at the hats. Everything we've been discussing. Look at that Art Nouveau curvilinear hourglass shape. She has an hourglass shape as well. Wow, it's kind of elegant, isn't it? What I suggest you do now is take a break. This would be a good point for you to stop watching and come back to the rest of the video as we look at the art of the era, move into the 1910s. I don't want you to get overwhelmed by overly long videos and trying to process all of the information I'm giving you. So each lecture will be about 2 hours, so take it in 2 chunks. And then it's not such a pain, is it, to watch an hour. So take a little break and I'll see you when you come back, refreshed, be it later today or in a couple of days. Okay, welcome back if you took a break. Let's turn our attention to the art of the 1900s and 1910s. We'll be looking at more art in this lecture than any other for obvious reasons. What are those reasons? Well, as you've already seen, film was rather limited, and we didn't have television yet, let alone MTV, music videos, and all of the other things we'll be looking at in later decades. So we'll be looking at more art in this lecture than any other, and boy, oh boy, what an exciting time in art it was, because this truly was the birth of modernity, of modern art. And I want to tell you about a few of the key art movements of the 1900s and 1910s and how they influence and impact fashion today. The first art movement I want to discuss is something called Fauvism, and the artists were called the Fauves. You can talk about Fauvist color, for example. Fauve, the word you see up there in the left, this is the French for wild beast, but not a scary wild beast, a free spirit in nature. And there were 3 dominant Fauvists: Vlaminck, Derain, and a guy I think you may have heard of, Matisse. The Fauvists used something called arbitrary color. And that might sound like a very art history kind of phrase, but when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Arbitrary color. Colors that don't belong where they're supposed to and are used arbitrarily. For example, if you look at the Derain canvas in the center there, we know that trees aren't pink, we know that roads aren't green, we know sky isn't bright yellow, but the Fauvists, they just chose whichever color spoke to them, making their canvases ablaze with all of this wonderful color. Arbitrary color, that's a phrase you should definitely know. Probably the most famous Fauvist painting is this one. It's called Calme, Luxe et Volupté, and it uses a technique called pointillisme, or pointillism. This is by Matisse. It's a very famous painting, and it lives at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Calme, Luxe et Volupté means calm, luxurious, and voluptuous. Pointillism, you can see the picture is made up of little points, little dots, right? Calm, luxurious, and voluptuous. What's happening in this painting? Well, you can see these lovely, voluptuous ladies are enjoying a naked picnic on a beach. And you can see the use of arbitrary color, right? We know that beaches aren't bright orange and bright pink, nor are ladies purple and green. But this is exactly what we mean by arbitrary color. Now, why this painting is particularly important, you'll see that Matisse used the same brush stroke when painting the sky, when painting the trees, when painting the ladies. What's he saying by doing this? What he's saying is that we are part of nature, that man is no greater than anything else in nature, and we should just embrace it, never mind this modern world with elevators and tramcars. The Fauvists felt we were getting away from our natural state, and through painting they wanted to take us back to our place in nature. And take a look at this. You can see how Fauvism is used in fashion today, right? Take a look at this painting by Derain, and then take a look at this Marc Jacobs, and you can see This was when Mark was going through his Fauvist period. This is why you really should take art history. I try to give you as much as I can in all of my courses, but we've got lots of other stuff to discuss too. But I really think that people who have great careers in fashion, believe me, when you talk to them, they've all taken an art history course or two. You should definitely do that. And if not, just buy a big fat book on the history of art and familiarize yourself with different artistic movements through the... But not every artist at the start of the century wanted to return to the past and embrace nature. Some were in love with this busy, bustling, urban, electrified new world. Meet the Futurists, the Italian Futurists. They were a movement in art, literature, and music. And they were Russolo, Cara, Marinetti, Boccioni, and Balla. Now, you don't have to remember all those names, but the most important name that you should remember is Boccioni. He was the most famous futurist. He was a painter and a sculptor. This is a Boccioni sculpture, and it's called Unique Forms of Continuity in Space. Wow, what a title. From 1914. And what he's trying to do here is show how a person looks when they're walking. The futurists were in love with the idea of dynamism, things moving. And so what he's trying to do here is show what it actually looks like when someone is moving, that sort of blur. This is a very famous piece of art, which is why it appears on the Italian euro coin. There's not a Michelangelo painting or sculpture. There's nothing by Leonardo on this euro coin. No, they chose Boccioni's Unique Forms of Continuity in Space, which I think is so cool. This is a futurist painting from 1909 in which electricity is trying to be depicted. It's really hard to paint electricity, but here is an electric streetlight. In a way, it's an epic fail, but I think this is what makes futurism so charming. Here is another futurist painting. Can you guess what it is? It's a motorbike. Balla, the artist in this case, was trying to show what it looks like when a motorcycle zooms past you. This, again by Balla, is one of my favorite paintings of all time. It's called Dynamism of Dog on Leash. And what he was trying to do here, as you can see, is depict the motion of somebody walking their little sausage dog there. And I think it's so adorable, those little feet whizzing around. This futurist painting from a second wave futurist, Fortunato de Pero, I love. It's called Radio Fire Up. And what he's trying to paint here is the moment when you turn a radio on. And you can see the electricity there at the top, depicted in yellow, and the sort of flame of electricity. And then what I love about this, if you look at the speaker, the radio speaker, you can see the sound waves coming out of it. And on top of the sound waves is a little bull. Why? Because he's trying to tell us that the song that was playing was about a bullfighter. So fantastic. This is a very famous painting by Boccioni called The Street Enters the House. How can a street enter a house? Can a street enter a house? Well, actually it can, and there is only one way that a street can enter a house. I'll give you 5 seconds to think about this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The noise of a street can enter a house, right? That's how a street can enter a house. And in this painting you can see the lady on her balcony and the chaos and noise of the city, which the futurists loved, entering her house. Just to remind you, this is Unique Forms of Continuity in Space by Boccioni, and look at those Philip Lim shoes, completely inspired by Boccioni. This is the most futurist dress I could come up with. It's actually starched and constructed to look as if the person wearing it is moving, or that the dress is caught in the wind. I think this is so futurist in intent. Take a look at those vans. Then take a look at that futurist canvas. This is why you need to know your art movements. Cubism. Cubism always seems to be the elephant in the room, doesn't it? I was an art history undergraduate. I did my BA in art history. And I was dreading Cubism. Cubism, it sounded so scary and hard and full of art theory, and oh my god, actually Cubism is the easiest of all the 20th century art movements. Basically, there were only two Cubists, Braque and his BFF, who I think you've heard of, Picasso. And what the Cubists were trying to do, basically, was show objects or people at different vantage points. When you look at a face, you seldom just see it still, unmoving and staring at you. Know when people talk, their heads move around. And this is what Cubists were trying to paint. They were trying to paint all angles at the same time. They were also obsessed with something called the void, the inside of things. What makes a vase or a vase, what makes a vase a vase? Well, it's not the ceramic or the porcelain, it's the void inside, isn't it? It's the hollow inside of a vase that makes it a vase. What makes a guitar a guitar? What gives it its noise? Well, it's the hollow inside the guitar that gives a guitar its purpose. And so the Cubists tried to paint the inside of things as well. So it was kind of an intellectual game. Very rarely do you find much color in Cubist art. A lot of grays, a lot of beiges. Why? Well, it's a practical reason. If they incorporated too much color, it would have been impossible to read these paintings. It would have just been a mess, although Picasso would go on to incorporate color in his work. Like this. You can see the guitar there. You often find musical instruments that are hollow in Cubist painting. And Picasso also liked the harlequin check that you see the musician wearing here. And of course, Cubism is beloved by fashion. See? This is a detail from a very famous Picasso early Cubist work called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, the Ladies of Avignon, and it lives at MoMA, Museum of Modern Art, and you can see he's painting these multiple vantage points in the faces. This also corresponds to a period where Picasso was very interested in tribal African masks, so you see a bit of that going on. And there is also an argument to say that he made the faces so grotesque on these women because he had just found out he had syphilis, that he had picked up probably from prostitutes, and that he was trying to, get across his anger at having syphilis. But I don't think that's the reason. I think he was just fascinated by African masks and this idea of multiple vantage points. But take a look at those faces. And you can see that, oh, poor models, the things they have to do. This collection, inspired by Cubism, went the whole hog with this incredible makeup, not the most attractive look I've ever seen, that obviously duplicates the faces in Demoiselles d'Avignon by Picasso. Another person I want you to be aware of is this rather handsome man, Marcel Duchamp. I can't stress to you how important Duchamp is in terms of 20th century culture. Here is a very famous piece of art by Marcel called LHOOQ. And what he did, he bought a postcard of the Mona Lisa. He was French, obviously, with a name like Marcel Duchamp. So, strolling along by the Louvre, they sell postcards outside, tourist-trapped places. He bought a postcard of the Mona Lisa, which, as you know, lives in the Louvre, and he drew a little mustache and a goatee beard on her. And then he wrote LHOOQ at the bottom and signed it. By doing this, he was asking a question. And the question is, what is art? Is this a postcard of the Mona Lisa, or is it the Mona Lisa? Well, it's the Mona Lisa. If I handed you that postcard and said, what is it? You'd say, oh, Halle, that's the Mona Lisa, right? By Leonardo da Vinci. If I handed you a postcard of LHOOQ, what would you say? Would you say that's the Mona Lisa? Would you say, no, that's Marcel Duchamp. He was asking, what is art? And when something is duplicated, is it still art? He thought it was. So, is that the Mona Lisa? Well, no, that's the Mona Lisa, right? Hanging at the Louvre. But what about this t-shirt? Is that the Mona Lisa? Which is the Mona Lisa? Are they all the Mona Lisa? Is only the original Mona Lisa the Mona Lisa? What is art? Can a postcard ever be art? Could a t-shirt ever be art? These are the kind of questions Duchamp asked at the beginning of the 20th century. And these are the questions we still ask about art today, don't we? Sometimes you'll go to a MoMA and you'll see sort of a brick sitting on a piece of newspaper, and it's billed as art, and you would be forgiven in asking the question, hang on, why is this art? But Marcel Duchamp was asking these questions over 100 years ago. He had a very long career, most of it devoted just to playing chess. He was actually a chess master. In fact, Duchamp was actually a genius with an incredibly high IQ, a very smart man, but also a very funny and naughty man. LHOOQ, in French, if you say it phonetically, it sounds like LHOOQ, LHOOQ. And if you write it out, LHOOQ means, she's got a hot ass. Wow, he was cheeky. He was so naughty that what he would do, he was one of the few artists who were famous during their own lifetime. He started writing to newspapers whenever there was a Duchamp exhibition, complaining about Marcel Duchamp and pretending to be a woman called Rose Celavy, who was so outraged and disgusted by Duchamp, who would write these rambling letters complaining about Duchamp. He enjoyed doing that so much that he started dressing up as Rose Celavy, there he is as Rose Celavy, and going to his own exhibitions where he would be horrified and pretend to faint, and everybody knew it was Marcel. So he was a very, very funny man, but a very smart one. And this idea of reproduction, duplication, it's still such a talking point today. Think about music artists and MP3s, and, you know, if you go and see Adele in concert and you hear her sing, you are experiencing Adele. If you download an Adele song, are you still experiencing Adele, or is that a duplication of what Adele did on stage? You see, these are really cool, interesting questions to toy with. Anyway, that's Marcel, and I want you to know about him. He's one of my favorite people. Less famous, but so much fun, was vorticism. I think you can already tell by looking at this Vortic canvas that the Vortics were really not up there with the Cubists or the Futurists, but they were so much fun, and I want to make an important point. Vorticism was an English art and literature movement headed up by this very handsome young man, Wyndham Lewis. There he is. The Vortics were outrageous. They were anarchic. They were sort of like the turn of the century's answer to punk rock. As I said, they were an artistic movement. They did paintings, but really it's Vortic writing and literature that has endured. They brought out a magazine, Wyndham Lewis was the editor, called Blast, in which every edition they would either bless or blast the oddest things. For example, bless the hairdresser. He attacks Mother Nature for a small fee. Hourly he ploughs heads for sixpence, scours chins and lips for threepence. He makes systemic mercenary war on this wildness. He trims aimless and blah, blah, blah. It goes on. And it's pointless and it's funny. So they would bless things and they would blast things. Blast humor, quack English drug for stupidity and sleepiness. But then, of course, in the following edition, they would bless humor. It is the great barbarous weapon of the genius among races. They were very funny and they were very anarchic. And I kind of used the Vortics, Wyndham Lewis and his crew, to make you understand and make you really sort of connect with the idea of cool, young, artistic, hip people bashing the establishment did not start in the 60s. These guys were sort of the original hipsters, if you will. Okay, by the 1910s, the world was starting to feel rather modern, right? And fashion finally begins to catch up. And the silhouette changes completely. Alright, let's look at the body ideal of the 1910s. Here is our Grecian ideal, by way of comparison. And this little lady has the ideal body of the 1910s. What a difference to that tall, elongated, curvy Gibson girl, right? Petite, sloped shoulders, small breast, a curved waistline but not cinched in, smooth hips, and a rather large head, kind of like a little feminine doll. The world was getting very industrial, it was getting very busy, it was getting very modern, and so the body ideal became very petite and very feminine and very doll-like as a reaction. And then, when we dress her, you will see that, as always, fashion follows the body ideal, not the other way around. And there it is. See, her head is rather large looking, isn't it? This very petite body. Who else had a body like this? This rather dramatic woman, Gloria Swanson she is called, and she was a silent movie star, again with that tiny little body, tiny shoulders, and a rather large head. And with this brand new body ideal came a brand new beauty ideal, very different to what we saw in the 1900s. Let's take Sarah and turn her into the ideal beauty of the 1910s. It starts off with a dark, smudgy eye makeup. Now this is fashionable women, trendy women. A lot of women still refused to wear makeup, but if you were hip, you wore eye makeup. Quite dramatic eye makeup. Plum-coloured lips with a gloss to them, again only if you were hip. And then you would have piled up hair that I'll explain more about in a second. And usually, if you were terribly trendy, some sort of silk scarf in an exotic print. Like this. See? This is the beauty ideal. And here it is. Today, we still like that look, don't we? And this is where it started in the 1910s. And another image that draws on this makeup look of the 1910s. Hair. Now, I know you are all programmed to think that no woman cut her hair short before 1920. False. Fashionable women started bobbing their hair like this in the 1910s. Most women didn't dare. They were too scared, remember? At the turn of the century, you had to have hair you could sit on. The longer and more luxurious your hair, the more beautiful you were. So you had to be pretty daring in the 1910s to chop your hair off like this girl here did. This was called an Eton bob, E-A-T-O-N, after the boys' school in England, Eton, where the little boys had haircuts like this. But this was pretty daring stuff. What most women did was this. It's sort of a cheat. They would bob their hair at the front, cut it short at the sides, and then they would leave the back long and wear it up like this, in a bun at the back. So from the front it looked like they'd been terribly daring and chopped their hair off, but they hadn't really. Look at this picture here again. You can see the scarf, the ribbon around her forehead there. That was a real trend in this era. I don't know if she was daring enough to cut all of her hair off or if she just cut the front short and it's piled up at the back. But that was the look, and isn't that a pretty picture? What a pretty girl. This girl is very trendy. She dared to cut all her hair off, and doesn't she look fat? So in the 1910s we had freedom from the corset, but a new fashion constriction keeps women in their place. The hobble skirt. The hobble skirt. Please take a look at the hem of this skirt. It's a beautiful, beautiful suit, isn't it? But look at the hem. It's so tight. It was called a hobble skirt because this is how you parked your horse. To stop horses galloping away, you would put one of these leather straps called a hobble around its hooves to stop it running away. The hobble skirt kind of acted on the same principle. Women couldn't take large strides in it, so this is quite metaphorical, isn't it, as well as anything else. In fact, some of these hemlines became so tight that a leather strap or even a metal ring was sewn into the hem to stop women from ripping their hemlines by walking naturally. And here are some examples of women in hobble skirts. Eventually, the hobble skirt gave way to something called a kick pleat. A little sort of a pleat, a little seam which allowed more freedom in movement. A kick pleat, we still call a slit in a skirt a kick pleat. So some of these skirts eventually had slits, but the idea was to really create this silhouette of being very tight at the bottom. The hobble skirt is the latest freak in women's fashion. Skirts are so tight around the ankle that locomotion is seriously impeded and speed is impossible. This was a fashion craze. It was a trend, and here it is written up as a sensational story. This is a hobble skirt race, obviously just for publicity, a race to see who could run the fastest, if at all, in their hobble skirt. I love this. It's a postcard, a joke postcard. Look at her. I can't kick. She can't kick because she's wearing a hobble skirt. And in my research, this was one of the most wonderful things I ever found, a news story, injured in hobble skirt. Mrs. E. Van Kutsen, while alighting from a runabout, it's like a car, falls on pavement. Yes, you can see here, she tripped and fell to the pavement, bruising her hand and face and cutting her lip slightly. Her foot caught on the steps in some manner. As she was wearing a hobble skirt, she was unable to save herself, and she fell prone upon the pavement, striking her face. See? Fashion. It's always been newsworthy. And here are some recent runway looks that pay homage to the hobble skirt. You know what? If something in fashion is a bad idea, you can bet we'll revive it. By the mid-1910s, fashion has finally and properly caught up with the rest of the 20th century. See? She looks like she could jump on a subway, doesn't she? So we really are seeing movement now. And here are some images from the 1910s so that you can get a read on what it looked like. And it really is very, very different, isn't it, to what we saw at the turn of the century with the Gibson girl. Now, many of you would be forgiven for looking at any of these images and saying, oh, they're from the 20s. They're not. Fashion really did start to become quite modern in the 1910s. It wasn't a revolution in the 1920s as many people think it was. Certainly it was a revolution in the sense that hemlines rose, but the actual silhouette in the 1910s wasn't all that different. Remember in our introduction lecture when I said that designers don't change fashion, but that brilliant designers tap into what people are feeling and then give them what they don't even know they want yet? You remember me saying that, right? So I want to introduce you to the most famous designer of the 1910s. This guy, Paul Poiret. Paul Poiret is credited with liberating women from the corsets. Women didn't wear corsets in the 1910s. There was something called stays, which were sort of an undergarment that kept you pert, if you know what I mean, and kept all of the jiggly bits in place. They were a lot more comfortable. Paul Poiret was the designer really at the forefront of this new silhouette, and he also introduced ideas like exoticism, color, wild print into women's fashion for the very first time. When I show you what he was doing, that's his famous trumpet dress, sometimes they call it the lamp dress, you can see just how exotic and new and outrageous his clothing was. Look at that! He was very inspired by the Russian ballet, the Ballet Russe, who had incredibly theatrical and exotic costumes, and he took this theatricality, this exoticism, and incorporated it into his work. Look at that coat. Look at that print. Women had never worn stuff like this before Paul Poiret came around and told them it was okay to. Here is a program from the Ballet Russe, and you can really see the influence that it had on Poiret. And he was also really a kind of a lifestyle designer. He designed textiles, and he had his own fragrance and cosmetic line. This is a bottle of perfume, Poiret perfume, and you can see it all speaks to this exoticism, right? His muse was his wife, Denise, and there she is wearing Paul Poiret. And you can see this exotic, new, modern woman in the 1910s coming to life. And there she is again. This is extraordinary. His work was amazing. It was revolutionary. And his label has been relaunched, and that is a modern take on the Poiret look. As is that. Look at the colour. And take a look at that Marc Jacobs. Oh, Marc, we can always rely on you. Look at the print. Look at the silhouette, and then look at the Poiret coat next to it. I love this quote by Paul Poiret. "I do not impose my will upon fashion. I am merely the first to perceive women's secret desires and to fulfill them." Isn't that what I just said? Absolutely. You go, Paul Poiret. There's somebody from the 1910s I want you to be aware of who was a commercial artist and fashion illustrator, and his name was Erté. He had a career that extended into the 1920s and even the beginning of the 30s, I believe. But we really associate him with the 1910s because he embraced this stylish and stylized exoticism that we see in the fashion of the era. And there is Erté himself. He often placed his figures against a black background, and you can see how incredibly exotic and modern it is. They almost look like cartoon characters, don't they? But in a very, very chic, very modern kind of way. There is another example of Erté, and you can see how incredibly exotic all of this was. He even constructed an entire alphabet out of his female figures. There is Erté on the cover of Harper's Bazaar doing the illustration on the cover. Erté is so famous and so iconic, and his work is so beautiful that it'll come as no surprise to learn that fashion channels and pays homage to Erté constantly. And in my research I found this, which I think was kind of nifty. Somebody has done all the Disney princesses as if they were Erté girls. Here is Pocahontas in the style of an Erté illustration. Cool, huh? Here's something that may look rather familiar to you. Take a look at that sign, Hollywoodland. That sign was only supposed to be temporary. It was there to advertise land that was for sale, Hollywoodland. The land eventually fell off, but the Hollywood remained, and of course that is the iconic Hollywood sign in the Hollywood Hills, because in the 1910s, this is when Hollywood took off. Believe it or not, America's first movie studios were not in California, they were in Chicago. But the climate there did not allow for filming throughout the year. By the 1910s, film had progressed a lot. People no longer were content to watch a baby eating or a train entering a station or something like that. Now we had the era of the silent movie with proper storylines, even though the stories were, they were rather limited, to say the least. A love story, a cowboy story, a story about a bank robber, but very, very simple stories because, of course, there was no dialogue. It was the silent era. This is when we see the first studios taking off, Metro, United Artists, etc. And take a look at what's happening in this picture here. They're actually filming what looks like a Western in the Hollywood Hills, and there is the crew waving. It took no time at all for the idea of Hollywood and movies and movie stars to take off. And the biggest movie star of the era was this woman, Mary Pickford, who at the height of her career became the richest woman in America. She always played characters much younger than she was. She would play children or sort of adolescent girls. She had these long curly locks, and as you can see, she was very pretty. And she really was the first big movie star. And of course, there were movie magazines, just like we have People magazine today. Photoplay, Mary Pickford herself and her career begin in this issue, Beauty and Brains. Mary Pickford again on the cover of Motion Pictures, and you can see she has this, very sort of Edwardian look, very dated in her movies. However, in real life, she was much more the kind of modern, exotic 1910s woman, but in movies she always played these sort of Edwardian little girls. And there she is again. And there she is again. She was hot property. This was the birth of the movie star. So by the mid-1910s, the world was truly modern. Reforms were coming into place regarding child labor. The suffragette movement was on the rise. Everything could have been great, but then something awful, awful, awful happened. World War I, the Great War, they called it. They also called it the war to end all wars. As you know, it certainly wasn't. There are very few dates that an adult human being needs to know in history. However, educated people know certain dates. They're essential that you know. The dates of World War I, the dates of World War II, the dates of Kennedy's assassination, etc. So please note the dates of World War I, 1914 to 1918. The war was actually sort of territorial. It was over land in Europe, in sort of northern France and what we have come to know as Belgium today. And yet the world got involved. There was a real drive to recruit boys to go and fight in this war. You've all seen this image before, right? The Uncle Sam with the top hat pointing. I want you for US Army, nearest recruiting station. Surely you will fight for your king and country. Come along, boys, before it's too late. That is a British recruitment poster. L'infanterie française dans la bataille. Obviously a French recruitment poster. Attention, Canadian Grenadier Guards now recruiting. You have to remember, during this era, very few people questioned authority, right? Even Wyndham Lewis, remember Wyndham Lewis from the Vortic movement? Even he signed up for World War I. People really had a sense of patriotism. And even though this really wasn't a war of good versus evil, as World War II would be, people still felt they should do their duty, and they signed up in droves. Where do you think this recruitment poster comes from? It's nice in the surf, but what about the men in the trenches? This is an Australian recruitment poster. Now remember, places like Canada, Australia, they were part of the British Commonwealth at the time. World War I, we were fighting Germany, as you know, but we had all of the Commonwealth nations, as well as America, to fight the Germans with. This is a recruitment poster from India, because remember, India was part of the British Commonwealth at this point too. And of course, the Germans had their own recruitment poster, persuading their young men to really give up their lives and go fight in this awful, awful, pointless war. But people signed up in droves. Look at all of these men. Many of them would not make it back. But look how happy they are to sign up and do their bit. And I want you to look at these soldiers from World War I. What do you notice about them? Well, they're children, aren't they? Now, don't get me wrong, there were strict rules. I think you had to be over 18 or over 21 to sign up. Oh, please. Any kid who wanted to go fight, they would sign them up. Fake their papers. Oh yeah, you look 18. Off you go. These are children. It's so heartbreaking, especially when you find out what happened to them. World War I was fought in various places. It was fought in Turkey, it was fought in North Africa, but predominantly it was fought in Flanders fields. Flanders is in sort of northern France, Belgium. Belgium was created because of World War I. These poppy fields were really the site, the main war front of World War I. And this is what these poppy fields looked like during the war. World War I was tragic and hopelessly human, because all of that wonderful new technology that we had just invented to make our lives easier was so quickly put to use in killing each other. There were new technologies in war, things like tanks, machine guns, planes, aeroplanes, flight, that brought with it so much promise, was so quickly used to drop bombs. And these zeppelins, these dirigibles that would float silently through the sky, menacingly. It was so sad, it's so tragic, it's so us, isn't it? Human beings to take something good and so quickly turn it into something awful. There was also biological warfare. Now you probably think biological warfare is something very new. It's not. There was something used in World War I called mustard gas. Throw a canister or a grenade of mustard gas, and people who inhaled it, it would burn their esophagus, and if it landed on their skin, it would burn them horribly. Now listen, guys, I don't sugarcoat history. We look at an awful lot of pretty dresses in this course, and I think it's kind of disrespectful to not also show you the not so pretty side of history. So I'm briefly going to show you what a victim of mustard gas looked like and how he would have to live the rest of his life. This is the victim of a mustard gas attack. It's no wonder that so many women volunteered to be nurses in World War I. Now you'll learn all about, women joining the workforce in World War II, but they also did in World War I, and many became nurses, and they went into the field hospitals in Flanders and did an amazing job trying to help these poor young men. World War I is an example of something called trench warfare. Basically, in Flanders fields, these long trenches, they were deep, they were long, and they went on for miles and connected and interconnected, is where soldiers lived and fought. They would live in the trench, and then on the command of their officers who were safely at a distance, they would radio in their instructions because, of course, this is another new technology that was put to bad use. Guys would line up, then they'd climb out of the trench and they'd go running across the field. At the same time that the opposition in the other trench would get up and run across the field, and it was basically who could kill the most people when they were out on the field. And then those who survived would stagger back to their trench. People lived for months in these trenches, which were full of rats, disease, constantly damp. These guys constantly had their feet in muddy water, which is why they developed something called trench foot, where their feet being submerged in cold, dark, muddy water constantly would eventually eat away at their feet. This is an aerial view of part of Flanders, and you see all of those little lines like a jigsaw puzzle. These are trenches, and they went on for miles, connecting and interconnecting. I have to tell you about something so sad I might get choked up. It's so sweet and it's so awful. It just really speaks to how pointless war can be. The Christmas truce of 1914. It was Christmas Eve in 1914. The Allied boys, English, Australian, American, French, etc., were in their trenches. And the Germans were in their trenches, the German boys. And who knows whose idea it was, but somebody, one person, came out of his trench with a white flag and started walking across the field. He could have been gunned down, but he wasn't, because the other trench, somebody thought, hang on, what's going on? And they climbed out of their trench and met halfway. And one said to the other, listen, it's Christmas Eve. I'm getting choked up here. It's so sad. It's Christmas Eve. Our officers don't know we're doing this, but why don't we all spend Christmas together? And they did. You know, they exchanged what they had. Oh, I've got some chocolate. Oh, I have some cigarettes. I have a bottle of whiskey. And then they played a game of football to celebrate Christmas. They showed pictures of their loved ones. They sang carols. They said prayers. And the very next day, they went back to killing each other. This is war. This is a man I want you to know about. He was called Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae. He was a doctor, and he was with the Canadian military. And he was also a bit of an amateur poet. And he wrote a poem one night with candlelight in the trenches, with war going on all around him. And the poem he wrote became the official poem of war. And it's called In Flanders Fields. And it is written from the perspective of the dead, of those boys who died. In Flanders fields the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly. Scarce heard amid the guns below, we are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high, if you break faith with us who die. We shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. 2 weeks after writing this beautiful poem, Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae was killed in Flanders fields. Well, lest we forget all of those boys who lost their lives in Flanders fields in Britain on our equivalent to Veterans Day, Memorial Day. We call it Remembrance Sunday. Volunteers, like this cute young man here, sell paper poppies, and you put a little donation, whatever you like, whatever amount you want, in his little can there, and you wear a poppy. and the money goes to the families of servicemen who lost their lives or injured servicemen. And Poppy Day, as we call it, is very important. And everybody, whether they're English or not, if they happen to be visiting England on Poppy Day, on Remembrance Sunday, wears a poppy. There's Prince William and Kate Middleton wearing their poppies. That's Johnny Depp wearing his, Angelina Jolie wearing hers, and even mean old Simon Cowell is wearing a poppy in remembrance of those who lost their lives not only in World War I, but in all wars ever since. In 2014, it was the 100th anniversary of World War I, the start of World War I, and an artist in England called Paul Cummings was commissioned to do something incredible to mark this 100-year event. He made almost 1 million ceramic poppies that were displayed around the Tower of London in England, in London, obviously. 88,800 and something. A poppy for every British person, whether they were English or from a Commonwealth country, who was killed in World War I. What an incredibly beautiful and incredibly moving tribute. And there is a close-up of one of these ceramic poppies. Okay, every lecture, when appropriate, we're going to have a think piece. Just a little something, maybe a bit controversial for us to think about. And this time, I want you to think about this for discussion in this week's discussion board. Knowing the suffering, the death, the heartbreak of World War I, how do you feel about these fashion images that are inspired by World War I? There's another one. And what about this World War I inspired runway look? And what about that? Oh, trench warfare made chic. Considering that 17 million people lost their lives in horrible, horrible ways during World War I, should fashion be channeling World War I at all? That's something to think about, and we'll discuss it in our DB. World War I ended in 1918, and you'd really think that, we'd be given some kind of break. But no, the opposite happened. In 1918, the world was hit by something that took even more lives than World War I. The Spanish flu. There was a strain of flu, Spanish influenza they called it, and they think that in fact it did start in a field hospital in France during World War I. This flu was dreadful. It wasn't like the flu that we get, every winter. This was a very violent strain of flu that was incredibly contagious. Millions of people were hit by Spanish flu. Take a look at this. Influenza pandemic, mortality in America and Europe during 1918 and 1919. You see that big spike there? That is Spanish flu. 500 million people died in 1918 and 1919 from Spanish flu. And this is on top of the 17 million who died during World War I. So in the final 4 years of the 1910s, the world lost approximately 5% of its entire population. 17 million lost their lives during the Great War, and then 500 million lost their lives to the Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918. Good Lord! In 1919, the Western world was in a state of utter devastation. No wonder it wanted to draw a line under the first 2 decades of the 1900s and start the 20th century from scratch, which is exactly what it did. and you simply won't believe how quickly and dramatically fashion responded. I'll see you next time when we roar into the Jazz Age.